Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's Neurotheory Forum. This is a joint effort between Tim Vogel's lab at IST and my lab here at Oxford. And this week, we're very glad to have Brad Wyble, who's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Pennsylvania State University. And Brad has done a lot of beautiful work at the intersection of vision, attention, and computational models, I would say, and also has some theories. This is where I first saw his work about the role of theta rhythms in episodic recall. And today he'll be talking about the when, where, and what of visual memory formation. And just before we launch in, a few notes. You can put clarification questions in the chat, and Brad should be able to see that. And you can put questions that you want to leave for the end into the ask a question functionality, and we'll get to those at the end. And then after the whole talk, we invite everyone to a sort of like post-talk discussion in a Zoom room. You're all very welcome, and I'll send the link out in the chat to that Zoom room afterwards. So take it away, Brad.
All right, thank you very much. For giving me the chance to come and talk to you folks. I also want to thank Tim Vogels for giving me the invitation. And what I'm going to talk about is a kind of retrospective look at a lot of the work that I've done over the course of my career related to how visual memories are formed. And so it's going to be sort of walking through about 25 years of research contextualized in 3 different computational models that we've developed as we've moved through that period. And I want to give a lot of credit to collaborators that I've worked with over these years. Howard Bowman, my postdoc advisor, Chloe Callahan-Flintoft, who was a graduate student of mine who now works at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds as an independent researcher for the Army Research Lab, Mark Neubenstein, who works at Groningen University, Molly Potter, who worked at MIT for a long time, and I was really lucky to have a chance to work with her for a few years. And 2 of my current graduate students, Shaku Hedayati and Ryan O'Donnell, have all contributed to the specific work that I'll be talking about today. I also want to thank the National Science Foundation and also the Israeli Binational Science Foundation for some of their financial support as well. So I'm going to start with framing a sort of general problem of vision. This is not the only vision problem, but at least one of them, which is to understand how we go from the continuous nature of visual experience to a subset of remembered information. Now, of course, we all know that that information is first filtered through a set of eye fixations, obviously. But in addition to that, there is an additional component of attention whereby this information is further restricted to produce a subset of things that we consider to be memories. Now, you know, some people question the notion of attention as a useful construct, you know, saying that it's not really well defined. And I disagree with that. I think that attention is easy to define, and it is simply this: it's deciding which information to discard. That's all it is. And the human body is basically just rife with different attentional mechanisms from the head to toe, right? In the eye, we've got the fovea, which is a dense concentration of photoreceptors that can catch photons from very specific locations. We've got the fingertips, which have touch receptors that we can deploy to gather information about surfaces and objects. And we've got the auditory system as another example that can tune itself to specific frequencies. So there's, you know, and in addition to the sensory side of things, we also have a number of internal cognitive attentional mechanisms that exist. So, you know, there are a lot of different attentional mechanisms that are in the body and in the mind. And I think the sort of challenge when thinking about attention is to be specific about what particular subset of attentional mechanisms you're dealing with, rather than to think of attention as a kind of unified monolithic construct. And so with that in mind, let me sort of focus on describing that from my research. So I study what I refer to as reflexive visual attention. And what that means is that this is a form of visual attention that is deployed very rapidly in response to different things that we see in the environment. And it's deployed so rapidly that we do not have time to sort of make conscious, deeply introspective sort of decisions about exactly what this attentional mechanism should do. It's kind of semi-autonomous. And so what that means is that it has to make decisions on its own using a set of algorithms that exist, although it can also be informed by our sort of top-down goals. So we have the ability to sort of influence what it does, but at the same time, it's sort of making up its own mind about exactly how it works on a moment-to-moment basis. And it has to do this because, you know, visual fixations are short, right? So it has to make up a decision about what to attend to within the time course of a single visual fixation. So within this sort of scope of reflexive visual attention decisions, there are a number of different ways that we can address this. And of course, the common one that we think of is where. So where is attention currently being allocated, both in terms of where the eye is currently located, but also within the retinotopic field that the eyes are currently delivering, which subset of that is our covert attentional mechanisms are they focusing on. But there are other components as well. We can also talk about the when component, which is which of these visual fixations contain information that we're going to commit into some kind of memory representation. And we can also talk about the what component, which is to say, when we see something, what exactly do we build? What representation and what parts of that do we build, and what is the format of that representation? So the approach that I take in all of these cases is essentially the same one, which is to start with a set of empirical phenomena, which could be behavioral, they could also be related to neuroscience, and to use those phenomena to create a single model. So one model that's going to explain all of these different phenomena with a single parameter set. And the goal of this work, of course, is not to create the model itself, it's to do two additional things. The first of which is to generate some additional insights, which is to say that by the end of developing this model, we've usually come around to a completely different understanding of the underlying principles that were involved in the set of mechanisms that we thought we were exploring. And so, you know, we change our own understanding, and then we try to communicate that understanding in papers. And secondly, of course, we can come up with predictions. And these predictions are there to help drive additional cycles of experimental exploration to develop better models. By the way, I wanted to say that I can't actually see the chat window as it's currently located. So if you want to, if someone does make a comment, if you could feel free to interrupt, that'd be fine.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, yep. I will.
So the when, the where, and the what. I've organized them in this particular order: when, where, what, because this is the order in which I approach them in my career. So it kind of, it kind of makes a little bit more sense. They kind of lead into each other in this way. So I'm going to start off by talking about some of the modeling work that I did as a postdoc, looking at the aspects of temporal attention. And then I'll talk about the where and the what. So I'll start by describing an empirical phenomenon, which is called the attentional blink. And this refers to a metaphorical blink of an internal attention mechanism, sort of like a blink of perceptual awareness. And one of the earliest findings of this phenomenon was by Wechselgartner and Sperling in 1987. And in this experiment, observers would look at a stream of digits presented at a rate of 10 per second, so it's pretty fast. And then there would be a rectangle on one of them. And the task was to basically report all of the digits starting at the rectangle and moving forwards. So what they found, however, is this sort of slightly odd finding, which is that they could report the first two digits just fine, but then there was a gap. They had a very hard time reporting the third digit, and then they could report additional digits in a kind of second glimpse. So these sort of two little glimpses that they had. And this little gap in between later became known as the attentional blink. And so it was Raymond, Shapiro, and Arnell who gave this phenomenon its name. And in this now classic version of the paradigm, what they would do is present two targets in a stream, and participants try to report both of those targets. And the typical finding is that when the targets are far apart in time, like this, it's easy to report both of them. When the second target is presented more proximally to the T1, then it's harder to report the second one. And when it's immediately adjacent to the T1, then it's easier to report it again. So you end up with this U-shaped function when you map T2 accuracy against the temporal lag in between the two targets. So let me show you an example of what one of these streams look like. So you would be looking at letters, trying to look for letters and ignoring all the numbers. And this may not work very well in a streaming format, so apologies in advance. I'll just do that one more time. So there were two targets in that stream, an A shortly followed by a B. And the sort of conventional finding in the attentional blink literature is that it would be easy to report the A and difficult to see the B. The attentional blink is a very robust phenomenon. It occurs over a wide range of stimulus types, such as categorical characters, color mark characters, words, and even images. So for example, we'd ask you to report images that contain a dinner food, and you type in hamburger and then you might miss the noodles, for example. It's not just restricted to these serial streams. When subjects are given a search task containing two targets in a static display, so here you'd look for the T's among the L's, and if you track the eyes, what has been found is that people will miss the second target if they have just recently fixated on the first target. So I think the most interesting aspect of the attentional blink is the phenomenon of sparing. And so what this means is that when you have two targets that are separated by a distractor, the first one is easy to see, the second one is hard to see, and this is the attentional blink. But when you put them closely together like this in time, it's now easy to see the first one and the second one. And this is somewhat paradoxical from a resource or interference explanation, because you've sort of made the task harder, and yet people are have an easier time doing it. What's even more interesting is that if you put three targets in a row like this, you now see an effective improvement on the ability to report the target in this temporal slot. So what that suggests is that people are actually doing better on this task, even though you've given them additional work to do. And so for these reasons, we've favored an attentional control account of how this works. So this is a sort of broad strokes depiction of the computational model that we've developed, which is in its implementation a neural network, but I've sort of collapsed away the details here just to kind of give you a top level summary. So in brief, the model has three components: a target selective mechanism that triggers attention. Attention in turn feeds back to enhance targets, allowing them to be encoded into memory. And the memory encoding, when it's ongoing, suppresses the deployment of attention. So this model helps to clarify the importance of understanding the attentional blink as the product of potentially an adaptive / useful mechanism. Because if we eliminate this inhibitory connection here, the attentional blink disappears. So then the question is, well, why is it there in the first place? You can't have a model where there's a mechanism that only exists to reproduce the phenomenon. You want to sort of understand what's the rationale for having it there in the first place. So to better understand the model, here's a very simplified account of its temporal dynamics. When a target is presented, it triggers the deployment of attention. And that attention allows that item to be encoded into memory. And while this encoding is ongoing, while you're building that memory, attention is suppressed. And so if a target were to arrive during this sort of red period here, it would have a reduced likelihood of being spotted. Now you can also have a second target presented right after the first one. And what that's going to do is sort of extend the window of this attention, because this target arrived before the inhibition began. And you can in fact then extend it to a third target, basically continuing to push out this episode of attention. So the sort of ultimate behavior of the model is such that if you have a sequence of targets all presented in a row like this, what the model can do is wrap all of those items in sort of one of these episodes of attention, sort of combining them all into one cluster. Whereas if you have two targets presented, but with a break of less interesting information in between, the system is going to break them apart into two discrete attentional episodes. And the attentional blink that we observe is a consequence of the mechanism that produces this break. Again, so why is this happening? Well, that I think is the interesting question. So we think about this in the context of visual input, when the eyes are free to move around from one interesting object to another. And so in this context, for example, you look at one object and it starts to create a visual representation, and then the eyes move to another piece of information. the representation of that second one is probably going to temporally overlap with the fading representation of the first one. So what you're going to end up with in the sort of consolidated memory that you've built from this is a juncture, sort of a commingled representation of those two things together. So the possible implication of the attentional blink then is that if we think that one of the things that the visual system is doing is building a sort of database, I mean, not literally database, obviously, but like it's absorbing information that it uses to build a statistical model of how the world works by linking different features to different objects. If we have things that are sort of glued together in this way, it might make it more difficult for that system to properly understand which things are different from each other. And so what the attentional blink might be doing then is by providing temporal buffering in between these formed representations, it sort of acts to clean up the data set. It helps us to discretize the input that we're taking in. So, what have we learned? What's the end result of these many years of hard work? That the attentional blink is not necessarily a response to information overload, but could give us a hint as to some of the attentional mechanisms that our brain uses to help clean up our internal data set. So, going back to the sort of conventional notion of attention, we normally think that what attention is doing is it's taking an input from the world and it's sort of reducing it to a manageable amount so that we can make rapid perceptual decisions, and we can also take actions. But it could be that there's this entirely different aspect of attention. And I'm not the first person to say this. Like, for example, Linda Smith at Indiana also has a similar perspective on attention, which is that what attention is helping us to do, perhaps, is to create a better data set for ourselves. We're cleaning up our data set so that we can make better, more efficient inferences going forwards. So here's an example of one of many reinforcement literature, reinforcement learning paradigms out there. They work well when you have discrete states and transitions between them, and it could be that these attentional mechanisms are helping to sort of form the fundamental basis of at least some of these underlying representations. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute to catch my breath and also to see if anyone has any questions. And I'm also happy to take questions at the end. So any of these things are great as far as I'm concerned. Are some people having some issues with the screen sizing? Has that been resolved?
I'm not sure it's been resolved for everyone, but I think they may have gone to the YouTube version if it's a continuing problem for them.
So what exactly is missing?
They say it's just clipped at the top and clipped at the bottom. For me, if I make my window skinny, that corrects, and if I make it very wide, I get some clipping. But I don't think that's been working for everyone. No.
So I'm doing this through OBS for the first time, sharing the screen, and I'm guessing it's having a little bit of an issue there.
Yeah, we also have one question when you're...
Sure, yeah.
Want to go for, okay, so from Felix Schroeder, we have, has someone attempted to investigate such discrete stages of attention and decoding in neuroimaging studies?
So neuroimaging wouldn't be able to access things at this time scale just because of the hemodynamic response. So at least in terms of this specific set of phenomena, I guess the answer is no as far as I know.
Great. And yeah. And Barbara has a question. It is said that lying is associated with increased blinking. Is there any connection there?
And so this is a sort of metaphorical internal blink of attention, not a literal physical blink of the eyes. I don't know if there would necessarily be any association, therefore. I don't know if anyone's looked at that. Yeah, it's a fast answer.
Great. Looks like that's all we have at the moment.
Okay. Well, then let me move on to the next component, which is the where component of attention. We've created another computational model. This is more recently in my career, and we call this model Ragnarok. So Yul, can you give me just a little bit of feedback? How much is missing on the top? Is it sort of like the first, like half the top line and some of the captioning? maybe what we could do is just, I could go back to, I don't know if that'll work. Yeah, I don't know what else to do. I'm just sharing the screen in a normal sense. I can't think of another option. Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I guess unless it's possible to like shrink, but I don't know how you do that. You know,
to do it, yeah, because I've just got PowerPoint going in the top window. It might just have something to do with the resolution of that screen. So what I can do is I can bring up elevate the caption a little bit there. Okay, so sorry, moving back to the attention model here. The goal here is to create an account of basically how the attentional mechanism that we described in the previous section makes decisions about where to attend, right? So we've talked about the when component so far, but how does it determine what locations in the visual field should be attended? And we call this model Ragnarok. It's a clever acronym that my graduate students helped me come up with. It stands for Reflexive Attention Gradient Through Neural Attractor Competition. It's almost an abstract in the title. And it actually does a reasonably good job of describing how the model works. And the fact that it's been deliberately misspelled here actually makes it a lot easier to Google than if we had used a K. So this work was done in large part by my former graduate student, Chloe Callahan Flintoft. As I mentioned, who is now working at the Army Research Labs as an independent researcher. So the goal here was to develop a model of spatial attention. And there are a lot of them, of course, I recognize this. But our goal was to sort of approach the empirical literature very carefully by taking account of some aspects that are not often understood. So the first of these is that reflexive spatial attention is not simply a winner-take-all phenomenon where we deploy attention to the most salient region and then ignore everything else. For example, this form of attention has been shown to selectively inhibit distractors. So we enhance some locations at the expense of others. That's one of the several ways in which it's a little bit more complicated than just simply winner take all. Secondly, this form of attention can deploy simultaneously to multiple different locations. So it's not just simply choosing the one focal point. And third, this form of attention can enhance regions of varying size and shape. So it can act as a sort of shroud that wraps around objects of varying different types. So the goal was to create a model that has these different characteristics through basically some circuit engineering. So let me explain a little bit about some of the empirical benchmarks that went into thinking about the model in this way. First of all, how do we know that we can attend to multiple locations? So there are a number of findings that point to this, and let me tell you about one of ours. So in this paradigm, what we did was we presented 4 simultaneous RSVP streams and had subjects looking for letter targets, like in this case, a G and a K. And then we had 3 different conditions. In one condition, there was no cue at all. In some conditions, there was one cue. You can see these 2 red bars appear 1 frame prior, cueing the location of one of the targets. And in a third condition, there were 2 valid cues indicating the location of both targets. So in the uncued condition here, you can see that the ability to report individual targets by identity was about 50%. When we cued one of the locations here, it elevated the report of the cued target enormously at the expense of the uncued target. And so far, this just looks like, a standard biased competition understanding of how attention works. But if we cued both locations at the same time, what we did was now elevated performance on both of those locations. And in fact, we also had another analysis where we looked at what happens if there was an additional target in between the 2 cues, and that one does not get attended. So it really seems as if the attention is specific to those 2 discrete locations. And we can also see that it's elevating them to about the same degree as it would a single cue target. So it's not like it's not like you're dividing attention in half. It seems to have almost the same benefit. Now, another aspect of this model is that it is strongly linked to the EEG side of things. So one of the nice things about EEG and reflexive attention is that EEG gives us some very important time markers as far as when specific different things seem to be occurring. Now, it's always difficult to understand exactly what an EEG component represents, but that's why the computational modeling side is very useful, because we can sort of build a mechanism within the model, and then we can see how that links to the EEG data that we can record from the model as if the model was a brain. So one of the most important findings in the reflexive attention literature is known as the N2PC. And this is a specific component that is recorded if you take the scalp data from the left and the right parietal sides of the head and compare them. What you find is that when you present a target on one side of the visual display or the other, you end up with a negative on the contralateral side. So a target on the left would produce a negativity on the right parietal lobe. And this emerges very reliably at around 200 to 250 milliseconds after the target appears. And it occurs for a wide variety of different target types: letters, colors, numbers, words, pictures, etc. So this seems to give us a time marker as far as at what point in time does this attentional mechanism start to manifest. And by the way, the N2PC is this, it looks like this really tiny deviation between these two, but you can see, given the tight correspondence of the two traces on the left and the right sides of the head before and after this, that this is a very robust phenomenon. Another relevant component is called the PD, and this component seems to be a response to distractors. And so the paradigm here is quite clever. What you do is you present a target on the vertical midline, which means that it is invisible to a left-right subtraction. And then you put a distractor on one side or the other. And what you find is that there is this PD component, a little positivity on the contralateral side relative to where the distractor had been. So this seems to be related potentially to suppressing that distractor. So the interesting thing that we can get from these EEG studies is that in the N2PC and the PD sort of almost overlap in time. So it tells us that the attentional mechanisms involved in the enhancement and the suppression are occurring sort of almost at the same time, but the PD is shifted a little bit later than the N2PC in general. So it seems as if there's first attention to the target, and then just sort of on the tail end of that process, we have inhibition. And that sort of has helped to guide the mechanisms that we've built within the model to have that same temporal characteristic. So the Ragnarok model itself, in terms of its gross architecture, is not that unusual. It basically resembles a standard visual attention hierarchy with an early visual layer, some late visual layers, and then a convergent attention map where input sort of feeds together. This is a common characteristic of a lot of these models. What we have really done that is important, I think, is to dig deep into understanding the circuitry that determines how attention is mediated within this attention map. So I'm going to zoom in here on these three neurons and also three neurons here from one of these late visual maps, just to look at how that works. So this is the attention map up here. This is one of the late visual maps. And if we imagine that we present a target and a distractor simultaneously, each of them is going to activate a sort of specific location within the attention map. Now, the challenge of selective distractor inhibition is this. We want to inhibit selectively this location, but we do not want to inhibit all of the other locations like this one, for example. So how do we do that? Well, one possibility is to use a gating node. And so what this does is it inhibits this neuron, but only if a select set of conditions is true. One, it's receiving convergent excitation from another neuron within the attention map, but also it's receiving bottom-up excitation from this specific location from lower down in the visual hierarchy. And as a result, this location is going to be suppressed because this neuron only turns on with the conjunction of these two inputs. A parallel inhibitory gating neuron over here is not going to be excited because it's not receiving this bottom-up input. So with this mechanism, we can implement the selective distractor inhibition, which looks like this. So we have a target and a distractor presented simultaneously. Here's a sort of graphical depiction of what the attention map is doing. And you can see that initially, both of these stimuli are creating bumps in the attention map, but then as the inhibition mechanism kicks in, this one is selectively inhibited. So The other nice thing about this model, and there's a little bit of lag as my PowerPoint struggles to deal with this enormous movie I'm about to show you. What we're looking at here again is the attention map, and now we're going to look at the EEG trace that we calculate from the model. And this is done very simply by just subtracting the excitatory synaptic activity on one side from the other. And so we present this stimulus array to the model with the target on one side here, and the rest of these are distractors. And we can see that we create this bump. And as this bump is growing, we see also a growth in the sort of simulated EEG potential. So the imbalance in the activation across the two halves of the attention map creates this simulated N2PC component. And then you can see that it crashes back down again as these inhibitory mechanisms kick in. And so that's one of the most sort of interesting and counterintuitive aspects of the N2PC component, which is that no matter how long the stimulus is, the N2PC seems to have a fairly short fixed duration of about 100 milliseconds. And so what the model does is it simulates why this might be occurring, because you have that initial spike of activity, and then as the surround inhibition mechanism kicks in, the total amount of activity is decreasing, even though the bump is still there. So the sort of attention is still present at this point in time, but the N2PC has disappeared. And we can also look at how the model generates a PD component. So here we have a target presented on the midline and a salient distractor presented on one side. And now you're going to see that there are two bumps appearing in this map. So initially we have, here's the target bump, here's the distractor bump. And at this point in time, the model is simulating that there's a small N2PC in response to this salient distractor because the inhibition mechanism has not kicked in yet. But once it does, that one goes away, and now you end up with this PD component, which again is just a difference in the total excitatory synaptic activity between the two halves of the attention map. And you can see that the PD component is sort of semi-overlapping with, but a little bit later than the N2PC, which is in general agreement with a lot of these findings in the literature. The other thing that I talked about that I haven't yet told you how it works is simultaneous attention to two locations, right? So if we just had this mechanism, this model would not be able to easily attend to two locations. That would be a sort of unstable point in its dynamic space because each of these two items would be basically trying to inhibit the other one. So it turns out that there's a very simple workaround for this, which is to have another inhibitory link going from a given attention map neuron to its own inhibitory gating neuron. And what this allows the system to do is basically a given location can inhibit its own inhibition. So this competitive kind of inhibitory circuit is seen, for example, in invertebrates, where you want to have a sort of more stable solution to an unstable dynamic. And that's exactly what we accomplish here. This additional layer of inhibition allows the system to have two simultaneously or two or more simultaneously active locations. And so, for example, we can now have two targets presented simultaneously. Each one creates its own attentional bump, and they're stable. That's a stable solution because each one of these locations is protecting itself from inhibition by the other. And this doesn't necessarily this is not just restricted to two locations. This would also be true if we had 3 of these in a row or 5 or just even a continuous space. And I'll come back to why that's useful closer to the end of this bit. So what this means is that if you have, two items that are sort of triggering attention in the attention map, if one of them is substantially stronger than the other, either because of its physical salience or because of its task relevance, the stronger one is going to inhibit the weaker one. But if they are of approximately equal priority, then both of them will be coactive. So, what do we get from all of this modeling work? So, we've written this paper, and in this paper, in the discussion, we spent some time crafting a set of lessons that we learned. So basically, what have we ourselves learned from the construction of building this model? What are the insights that we've gained? And also, what are some of the predictions that we make for other people going forwards? So for example, you can download this paper now, and there's a number of predictions there that we have not tested. They're just sort of out there if anyone wants to use those as ideas to run in their own experiments, please feel free. That's sort of, what we're, we love people to do that. That's sort of the goal of this model, is to sort of facilitate and create new ideas that other people can work off of. And going back to the idea of lessons, we've also sort of, developing this paper has changed the way that we understand how attention works. And I'll focus on one of those lessons here. And it's this one, which is that attention is really about decision making. So that's the sort of interesting and hard part about understanding what an attentional mechanism is all about, especially reflexive attention, which has to make a sort of rapid decision. Because the idea is that the decision about what to attend to is necessarily made on incomplete information, because obviously you don't know what it is until you fully attended to it. So you have to decide to attend to it first. So these decisions are made as a sort of gamble that this is most likely to be the useful information. So we're going to sort of put our chips on that particular stimulus or those stimuli. And the second interesting thing that we've figured out from this is that decisions, at least in this sort of spatiotopic framework, are made in a continuous space. So rather than there being a discrete set of different alternatives like A, then B, then C, the possible space of decisions that the attention map could come up with is all possible spatial configurations. So basically sort of like it's basically a permutation of the number of different locations. So the decision space is enormous. And the way that the attentional mechanism here solves this is by basically solving it in parallel. Each one of these little microcircuits at each different spatial location works in concert with all of its neighbors to sort of collectively define which are the regions that we want to be attending to at this particular point in time. And so then we've sort of pushed this forward into thinking about how this works in more realistic domains, right? Where we have perhaps instead of discrete stimuli on the screen, we have a more realistic scenario like this. And let me, first of all, change this into an arrow to deal with okay. Okay, well, I'll be able to play these by clicking on them, which is a little bit clumsy. This first video has sound, which I apologize for. So 1 second. But it's basically this couple walking in to this wedding chapel. And what you can see is that if you look at a gaze-based, sorry, if you look at a salience model, that this is graph-based visual salience. It's one of many salience models out there. It gives you a simulation of the sort of most salient regions in the visual field. So let me see if I can play this one again. Sorry, the laser pointer in PowerPoint does not play well with videos. But there you can see that the white dress is obviously highly salient, but there's also a lot of other parts of this image that are also salient. And so then what we do is we feed those salience maps frame by frame into Ragnarok to see how it responds, what its decisions are about where to attend to. And what we see is a very different behavior, which is that it tends to have this very discrete shroud of information wrapped around the sort of interesting parts, and everything else is not attended. And in fact, if you look more closely, you'll see that there's this dark blue inhibitory surround around that region as well. And you can sort of put that back on the original visual stimulus. And so the sort of upshot of this is that what at least this implementation of attention is doing is created this very discrete delineation between the parts that are attended and the parts that are ignored. And this goes back to the thing that I was talking about in the first portion of this talk, which is that one of the goals of attention perhaps is to create this more discrete set of representations that makes it easier for subsequent learning mechanisms and subsequent kinds of decision action loops to make effective and efficient decisions using the data that has been gathered. Right? So it'd be a lot easier to basically deal with the information that you get from this very discrete representation perhaps than this much more distributed one. I'm going to pause again here to take questions. Let me bring up the Crowdcast window. I'm wishing I had 3 monitors instead of just 2. So I see Azir has asked a question or has made a comment that this looks a little bit like the attentional blink response. It does a bit, except that the time scale doesn't quite match up. So the sort of the dip that you saw there in terms of that inhibition is too fast to be an explanation of the attentional blink. The Ragnarok model, as we've described it, actually does not have a memory encoding portion to it, which means it lacks the inhibitory connection that would create the attentional blink. So ideally, what we would do next is to take this spatial attention model, link it to sort of memory encoding model, so that we could simulate how the attentional blink arises from the spatial attention mechanism. But that model, as it stands, does not actually have that encoding mechanism. If there are any other questions, I can take them now, or we can also take them at the end.
This might be a question that you want to take at the end, but up to you. So this view that attention is a decision, I mean, looking at the saliency map that this model generates for that wedding scene, it sort of also gets the sign in there. Yeah. And it was just making me think, like, sometimes you probably care about the sign, right? I mean, like, if you view it as a decision, can you actually divorce this from the rewards or your current goals or sort of those types of quantities?
Yeah, I mean, that particular salience algorithm, graph-based visual saliency, doesn't have a specific mechanism that would allow you to sort of weight different kinds of things depending upon your goals or what task you're performing. It's just a physical salience measure. But yeah, for sure, you would want to use sort of more flexible, configurable salience algorithm that can sort of weight things according to what you're looking for. Yeah, I mean, I agree also that sort of how you integrate things together, like, for example, you might decide to join this particular blob over here in with this blob over here because of the way that they are semantically associated. So there's sort of higher levels that you might think about in terms of what decisions you make about which things to include and which things to not include. And that is beyond the scope of what we can do with this model, because we're so focused on the spatiotemporal dynamics. But yeah, I agree completely that there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff at higher levels that we could think about.
Great. Looks like we have two more questions. A follow-up from Azir, I think. Does that then suggest that information that inhibited is also near the field that we focus, based on how Ragnarok responded to the wedding scene?
So there is certainly a sort of spatial surround, and that there's an enhanced suppression in the specific vicinity of something that's been attended, but the inhibition also extends outward from that as well. So yeah, the finding that there is a selective inhibition next to something that has been attended is a common finding in this literature, but it does not mean that it's only restricted to that location. Yeah, it's a good question.
And finally, Tom Wallace asks, the spatial inhibitory gain pool in the model is reminiscent of contrast gain control. Do you have any thoughts as to what insights building your model might yield for lower level visual processing?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. So the model doesn't have anything that's sort of explicitly like contrast gain control, although it may end up producing something like that in the aggregate behavior. I don't really have off the top of my head any specific insights about. We haven't tried to push this down to the lower level in terms of thinking about what this might entail for exactly how is attention implemented. So we have a very simplistic enhancement model, which is just simply we multiply the forward-going activation of any location. So there is no sort of specific implementation of exactly how the implementation lands on that V1 layer. We've sort of I guess we've decided that is an interesting problem, but not one that we wanted to tackle in this particular paper. I guess my sort of insight was that, at least as far as this model was behaving, it didn't matter a whole lot exactly how we implemented the attentional enhancement. We could find probably other parameters that achieved a stable solution as well. So there wasn't this wasn't a unique way of implementing attention.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so now let's move on to the third and final, and this is the most recent work that we've done. We're talking about what do we store in memory. And so this is a model called memory of latent representations. And it started with some earlier work by a previous graduate student, Garrett Swan, in 2014. And we've now moved on to a even more exciting model of memory that we've just this week submitted to bioRxiv in a journal. So let me tell you a little bit about how that works. So what is really in a visual memory? The modeling here was done by my graduate student, Shaku Hedayati, and the experimental work was done by Ryan O'Donnell. So when we see something like this baby Yoda, there's a question that can be asked, which is, what do we remember from it? And obviously, it depends upon our tasks and our goals, and there's a lot of different ways that we could build that memory. And that's sort of part of the point, which is that there are a lot of ways to build a memory, and how can we build a flexible architecture that can construct a wide variety of different possible memories from a given stimulus, depending upon what it is that you're thinking about. So we could imagine a sort of blurry image of the whole thing, a specific memory of individual objects, or labels attached. Like, for example, this is Baby Yoda, this is an alien, he's holding a mug, etc. All of these different things could belong to that memory. And so the other important inspiration here is the original paper by Atkinson and Schifrin back in the 1960s, which sort of helped to, and again, in psychology, everything that has been said has been also said 100 years prior to this. So we're not necessarily saying this is the first time someone said this, but this is one of the sort of most notable examples where we talk about how when we build a memory representation of something, it is a conjunction of input coming in from the world, but also draws from our long-term visual experience. So the memories that we construct are this sort of consolidation of both the input and our existing knowledge. So we wanted to build a model that sort of has this capability. So we start with the binding pool model, which we published in 2014. And the basic idea here is we wanted to be able to build a model of working memory that has the characteristics such that the information is stored in the firing of neurons. And I know that there's an enormous debate right now between silent representations where things are stored in synapses versus oscillations versus this kind of model. And this is just, we just wanted to sort of make a working example of how you could store flexibly information of many different types in a sort of active representation model. So we start with this binding pool, which is just a bunch of neurons. They're completely undifferentiated as far as what they respond to. We have a set of type nodes, and basically for each feature dimension that you might want to store, you would have a set of neurons that correspond to different values in that feature space, like color. And then we also have tokens, and the tokens index different items within the binding pool. And so these different parts are connected with static weights. So there are synaptic connections, but they only exist to get information into and out of the binding pool. Those weights themselves are not able to change. So each one of these little binding pool neurons is also a self-sustaining attractor. So once they're turned on, they can stay on, and that's how the memories will be stored. So for example, to encode something into memory, what we do is we would activate one of the, so let's say that we've got this blue arrow, we want to store the color of this arrow in memory. The first thing we do is turn on a token to indicate that we want to store this arrow color in that token. Then we activate the color representation in this type layer, and then we just project these into the binding pool, and then whatever neurons happen to activate from this particular combination of inputs, those neurons then become active. And then we can deactivate the type nodes, and the representation basically persists here as an active firing pattern. And then we could store additional representations. So we could then activate token 2 and store an additional pattern on top of this one. And then they would basically sort of overlap, producing some amount of interference, but still allowing you to reconstruct the individual representations. And this is characteristic of visual memory, which is that if you store additional memories at the same time, each one interferes with the other, causing some amount of degradation. So retrieval then basically works in reverse. You activate a token, and then for whatever binding pool nodes are attached to that token, you project them back down to the type layer, allowing you to reconstruct that representation, giving you a sort of noisy version of that particular color. Here, this is just a sort of depiction of projecting this onto this, and then we take the circular average of it. And so this is basically kind of generative model, and that you can reconstruct the original stimulus value. The sort of important point about the binding pool is that it's incredibly flexible, which is to say you could store, for example, any combination of orientation, color, and location to this token, and then you could store a completely different combination and attach it to this token. And the representations that you form are, importantly, content addressable, just like human memories are. So, for example, if you store some combination of location, color, and orientation, you could, for example, probe the model and say, hey, what was the piece of information at this location? Retrieve that token, and then from that token, retrieve what color it was. Or you could do it like this. You could say, hey, what was the red stimulus? Find which token was the red stimulus, and then from that information, retrieve what was the orientation. So you can sort of get at this information from any direction. So in the process of constructing this model, we started thinking, well, what would happen if we paired this with a sort of more sophisticated model of a visual hierarchy? So you pass this image into the model, and it activates a succession of representations all the way from the sort of very early sensory representations up through conceptual representations. So, all of these different levels of representation exist in parallel, and we could, in theory, project any of them, all of them, or subset of them into the binding pool. So the binding pool could represent information at a specific level of abstraction, depending upon how we wanted to remember that information. And so that was the sort of insight that got us to this new project. So for this, we started with a variational autoencoder. And folks here are probably familiar with this, but let me just describe it in brief anyway. A variational autoencoder basically has the simple training goal of reproducing on its output exactly what it gets on its input. And here we show, for example, a single handwritten digit of 8. But what this model takes as input is, this particular model would take in 60,000 different handwritten digits, called the MNIST dataset. And so it would try to basically learn how can it adjust these synaptic weights so that it can reconstruct all of these different 60,000 inputs. And so what makes this problem interesting, though, is that you squeeze it through this very small bottleneck, which could be as few as 2 neurons. So if there's only 2 neurons here in the bottleneck, what you create is a latent space, and this latent space contains basically a representation of all possible digits that this thing has been exposed to. So you can see here are some 1s down here. Some of them lean left, some of them lean right. There's some 9s and 4s, and they all have slightly different shapes. And this latent space is basically compressed representation of this entire stimulus space. So, we thought about this, and we realized that this is in some ways similar to, the organization of the visual system, and that you go from V1 to V4 to IT. And as you make this progression, you're creating representations that have comparatively fewer neurons representing a sort of more sophisticated stimulus than the previous layers. So here you would have, sort of orientation selective cells, but up here you might have cells that are selected for, different shapes, faces, etc. Then, in addition, these decoding layers on the other side of the autoencoder are somewhat similar to the feedback connections that go from IT back down to V4, back down to V1. So we thought we'd try to use this as a model of visual processing and attach it to a binding pool. Now, we wanted to make 2 important modifications to this. The first one is that we wanted to distinguish shape and color, and this would allow us to do some experiments with binding of shape to color, it's a very common way of approaching working memory. So we split the bottleneck into 2, and then we defined 2 separate objective functions, one that only optimized for shape and the other which optimized for color, and then they sort of merged back together again in the decoder. Then we fed into this model a sort of combined data set that we created, which was a combination of MNIST and also Fashion MNIST. Fashion MNIST is basically a set of 60,000 pictures of shirts and pants, shoes and purses and things like that. And we also added a color filter to give them sort of random, prototypical 10 colors, but randomly varying. And then what the model could do is it could reconstruct either the shape and the color jointly if you activated both maps, or if you zeroed out one of the maps, you could reconstruct just the color information, effectively eliminating the shape, or just the shape information eliminating the color. And the second modification we did was to provide a skip connection going from the first to the last layer, which could be used selectively when we want to reconstruct certain kinds of stimuli. So then we wanted to attach a memory representation to this. So we have a binding pool here, which can basically take information from any of these different latent layers on the encoder side, or also, reconstruct them back onto those latent spaces, allowing us to build memories in a very flexible fashion. And it works, right? So here we have original images. If we extract a binding pool representation from the L1 and then put it back into the L1 and then run the rest of the model forward from that reconstructed latent representation, we end up with these, pretty noisy but still recognizable representations of the original. And then here's what we get from L2, and here's what we get from the bottleneck maps, the shape and the color. And then this is what we get from the shape only map, and this is what we get if we build a memory from only the color map. So, the first thing you notice here is that as you build representations from later in the pipeline, you end up with more accurate representations. And that's because this is a more compact representation that can be more easily morphed into the binding pool representation and then retrieved. But the L1, it turns out, is very useful in a different way, which is that we can use it to build memories of novel stimuli. So here are Bengali characters that are given to the model as inputs. The model's never been trained on them. And the skip connection that I mentioned before allows us to reconstruct representations directly from the L1 going all the way to the end. That's helpful, but what we're really interested in is, can we build memories from this L1 representation that we can reconstruct? And the answer is yes. So here we see these reconstructions of the Bengali characters. So this is effectively similar to showing someone a stimulus that they've never seen before and then asking them to describe what they've just seen, which people can do, obviously. The other neat trick that we can play with this model is, because the binding pool is so generic in terms of the different kinds of information that it can represent, is we can store different kinds of codes for different stimuli. So for example, here's a red 9. We can push that into the encoder, and here's the representation of the shape, and here's a representation of the color. And we can use a classifier to classify those as, for example, red and 9, and we can push those labels, those one-hot labels, into the binding pool as well, in addition to the visual information. So we can build a memory that has a combination of the actual visual details and the labels of that information. Now, you might be wondering, what's the point of having the labels if you have the actual visual details? And the answer is that it's actually a lot easier to store these. And so there are certain cases where if you know that you don't need the visual information, you can just store the label information instead. Now, something else we can do is we can store, we can add a token layer to this model as well. And these tokens basically serve as an index, allowing us to pull out different subsets of the binding pool to represent different stimuli. So this allows us to store multiple items in the binding pool. By the way, let me just go back one quick point to clarify something that I hadn't made clear before. When we, for example, show you this, we're not storing, I really should have mentioned this, we're not storing all 6 of these items at once. We're storing each one individually in its own separate instantiation of the binding pool model. We've just collapsed them together for the ease of visual comparison. So we're not at this point in time storing 6 items and then retrieving 6 items. We're just storing 1 and then retrieving 1. But with tokens, we are actually able to store multiple different items and retrieve them individually. So for example, here we have a token where we're storing this 2 and then retrieving that 2. So basically a set size of 1 in this case. Here we have a set size of 2, the same 2, and then this blue glove, and you can see the reconstruction here. Here we have 3 items stored and 3 items retrieved. And you'll note, of course, that as we add more items into the memory system of the binding pool, the memories are getting increasingly fuzzy. We're losing detail information. And this is, exactly reflective of what happens with people when you ask them to store, 2 or 3 or 4 items in memory. The representations of each of them become weaker and noisier.
Can I ask a clarification question about the recall process? So when you present the token, say I want to recall the glove, you have this mixture representation in the binding pool. Like, how is that information actually used? How is the token information used to select out the specific memory without disturbing the rest?
So it does disturb the rest, but not completely. And so the way it works is that each token accesses 40% of the binding pool, chosen at random. So any two tokens are going to overlap in approximately they're going to overlap in about 40% of their neurons. So what that's saying is that when you store this 2 in this glove, the memory for the 2, about 40% of the neurons associated with this memory are also being used to store the glove. And likewise, 40% of the glove neurons are being used to store the 2. And that's why the representations get more noisy. So when you reconstruct, you're basically saying, all right, Mr. Token number 1, you're accessing this particular subset of the binding pool, use that to do your reconstruction. And that token does not know that 40% of its neurons are also being borrowed by its neighbor token. Does that help?
Yeah, got it.
Okay.
We have one other question here.
Sure, yeah.
Do you want to take it? Okay. From Rafal Bogach, we have, how do you ensure that different neurons in the bottleneck store separately the shape and color?
Yeah, it's a good question. We use 2 different objective functions. So for the shape objective function, we just simply collapse across the RGB channels. So that objective function is basically only caring about the sort of grayscale image. And then for the color version, we basically, I'm trying to remember exactly what the formalism is, but essentially we just wipe out all shape information in the objective function. So all that map cares about is the RGB color channel. Now, that representation works really well for these monochromatic stimuli, but obviously does not work as well for more realistic stimuli where you can have multiple colors in a single image. And so we've started to experiment, for example, with how can we get this model to also learn, like, for example, CIFAR images. And that is a really interesting problem. And we've made a little bit of headway by taking, like, for example, a CIFAR image and reducing it down to like a 5-color version using basically a k-means approach to sort of say what are like the 5 most common colors in this particular image, and then build an objective function that only cares about those 5 colors. And that works a little bit, but I think that the architecture that we're using here, which is just like a simple, fully connected network, is not great at dealing with that additional complexity of binding different colors to different locations.
Thanks.
Does that help? Okay. So what we can do now with this model is we can store the labels in addition to the visual shape information. And so this allows us to retrieve, for example, if we're storing 3 items where we're trying to retrieve the labels, what we're looking at here is accuracy of those retrieved labels as a function of set size. And you can see that the accuracy is falling off relatively slowly. So for the first 3 items, there really isn't that much of a cost, but then things start to get substantially worse for the 4th item and gets worse beyond that. So this is kind of characteristic of the capacity of memory. And in a lot of working memory experiments, people probably are using labels to store things, not the visual shape information. When we store the shape information instead, we can see a much more dramatic fall off of accuracy as set size increases. So the sort of neat thing about this model is that we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we build those memories by simply tweaking the parameters that determine what goes into a given memory. So we can store the latents with these different parameters, or we can store the labels with these parameters. And next we wanted to sort of explore, how flexible is the human system in terms of being able to turn on and turn off different components of memory. So the first experiment we ran in this space is to, first of all, figure out what happens to, the vast majority of working memory experiments involve like many repeated trials, and we discard the first few trials. We sort of ignore those as practice trials. We're sort of interested in what's the asymptotic behavior once people really know what the experiment is all about. But here we wanted to explore what happens in those first few trials to see what's the sort of default behavior of the system when you don't really have a good expectation of what you're going to remember. Because this is, I mean, true of a lot of daily life, right? Like we don't go around like, okay, I got to remember the color of this Mountain Dew can, right? Instead, we just are looking around and behaving. So in this experiment, what we did was we gave people the most ambiguous explanation we could think of, which is to say, we're going to show you some visual information. That's all we tell them. We don't even tell them that we will be asking them about it. We don't tell them what we will be asking. We just say we're going to show you some visual information. We don't even say that it's a picture or a character. It could be a movie for all they know. And then we show them this one Bengali character, and then after a short delay, we ask them to retrieve that information. And they're 95% accurate. So this kind of, validates our intuition that people are pretty good at just like building a sort of one-shot memory of things that they experience, even when they don't know what they're going to have to do with it. And then on the second trial, we make it a little more challenging because now each of these 4 response options are a different instance of that same kind of category. So here they're all different Bengali characters. Here there are 4 instances of the same Bengali character, and here performance is a little lower, but still really good, just for one trial. In this experiment, we wanted to see, do people remember the shape information for stimuli that they also have labels available for? So in this experiment, we showed people, again, gave them very generic instructions, just visual information, no specific expectation. This is a new set of subjects, by the way, so they haven't seen the previous one. We show them an MNIST 4, and then we ask them which particular 4 was it. So we're interested here, if you see this 4, do you just, with no expectation, do you just store the label, or do you also store shape information? And it turns out that people do store some shape information. So they're 85% accurate on that very first trial. And then they improve a little bit beyond that as well. So people seem, right out of the box to be able to do, to store the shape information, even when they have labels available. Now, we also wanted to see if people are able to turn off the visual information if they think that the visual information is useless. So in this experiment, it's basically the same presentation, except that now we give them a more specific instruction. We tell them, when you see a digit, we just want you to type in the number that it is that you see. And we do this for 50 trials, and people are really good at this, obviously. And then on the 51st trial, we give them a surprise question, which is, instead of asking them this question, we ask them, what did you see? And this is about the stimulus that they literally just saw a few seconds ago. Their accuracy is only 15% in remembering which specific 4 it was. So this seems to suggest that what happens is that people can basically turn off the encoding of shape information when they want to. And then on the very next trial, same question, now they're at 100%. So within just a few seconds, they're able to sort of retune their parameters so that they're building a memory that includes the shape information on the very next trial. One additional neat trick that we can do with this model is we can demonstrate that we can bind colors to individual shapes, even for categorically identical stimuli. So here, what we're going to do is we present 2 different colored MNISTs. Here's 1, 2, and here's a different 2. This one's bound to token 1, this one's bound to token 2. And then we cue the system with a grayscale image, retrieving token 1, and then we reconstruct the color that was associated with that particular shape of 2. And so we were then interested to see if people have the same ability, meaning if we give people 2 different 3s, but of different colors, can they reconstruct the specific color that was associated with that specific 3? Or does the sort of categorical similarity make that difficult? And the answer is that not really that difficult. So on the very first trial, they're 85% accurate in terms of being able to retrieve the exact color out of 10 options. Yeah, 10 options for that one. And they're 81% accurate on the remaining 19 trials. So people seem to have this ability. So let's go back again to the sort of insights. What do we learn from all of this? In the process of thinking about how we link long-term memories to working memories, we've thought of 2 distinct kinds of efficiency advantages. The first of which is a form of compression. And this is Shiku's figure. She did a great job of thinking about how this all works. As you progress through the visual pipeline, what you're getting is a more and more compressed representation, but that compressed representation doesn't really sacrifice the visual details for things that you're familiar with, at least in the space of of autoencoders, right? You can reconstruct information very accurately from this very reduced latent space because this whole part of the system has been trained on this particular subclass of stimuli. So for familiar things, you can create a very compressed latent code that has a very detailed level of representation. That's one kind of advantage. And the other kind of advantage is that you can also build categorical representations that are one-hot encoded, sacrificing essentially all visual detail information. They're amodal in a sense. And these are extremely efficient to store and retrieve. But of course, you sacrifice the visual details. And the model is able to take advantage of both of these different levels of efficiency by storing either these representations or these representations, depending upon the task. Furthermore, the model is still able also to store and retrieve novel stimuli by just drawing from this latent space. It can't store novel spaces. Novel stimuli do not work well at this from this latent space because it's so compressed. It just basically forces everything to look like a number or a piece of clothing. But this latent space is able to represent a very wide array of stimuli. So the other sort of insight that we get from this modeling approach is to think about how working memory might interact with other memory systems, like especially if you're building episodic memories. And so the nice thing about compressing everything into a single binding pool, as we're doing here, is that it makes it comparatively easy to think about how other memory systems could build on top of that. For example, you could imagine that like the hippocampus could store a snapshot of the state of the binding pool. And that is basically a copy of what was particularly interesting and relevant at this particular point in time. Because when this memory was constructed, you were already weighting the different input the different latent spaces according to their task relevance. And so you're all automatically building a memory that cares about the important stuff. And then of course, during sleep, you could reconstruct those memories back into the working memory and in a sort of generative fashion, train the cortex to build on those memories. So that's the sort of way that we think about this working, in the sort of broader context of memory across different systems. All right, and that is the end. Just as, sort of brief summary. Going back to the beginning, when do we attend? Well, the idea here is that we might use temporal padding to create more distinct memories. Where do we attend? We make rapid decisions in a sort of two-dimensional continuum. And what do we store? We have a sort of flexible memory storage from any latent space, and we use existing expertise to build these compressed representations that are more accurate than for novel stimuli. But we can still build novel representations if we need to. And that is that.
Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful talk. Let's thank our speaker. I guess I'm the only one who gets to do it auditorily. But so now we have time for questions. Please pop your questions into that Ask a Question functionality. If you want to pose your question directly, you can list that in your question, and then I'll bring you up on screen. I just want to get one in that Felix asked during your talk. He has a small clarification. Uh-oh. Let's see if we can get him back. I do this. Yes, I see. All right. All right, we're back. Sorry, yeah, so just to start with a very small question from Felix. He was asking for the reference for that remarkable experiment where you show that people don't remember the shape information on those surprise trials. Is that?
Yeah, so that's actually in the bioRxiv paper. So we included the experimental data. But we've also done a lot of experiments asking people to remember things in surprise trials. And we call this phenomenon attribute amnesia. And for example, you can look this up as Chen and Wyble 2015 as one of those papers, and there's a bunch of other ones as well.
Great, thanks. So maybe I can kick off with a question. I'm wondering if, well, Yeah, I have several questions. The first is maybe one you've gotten before, which is, have you tried sticking any of these ideas into a modern deep learning architecture? Do you think that's worth doing? Do you think it could be a route to interesting machine learning applications?
So do you mean basically like a convolutional neural network framework or something like reinforcement learning?
It could be any of those, yeah, but suppose you bolt Ragnarok onto existing CNNs,
Yeah.
which typically don't have any spatial attention whatsoever, right?
Right.
Or well, maybe implicitly somehow, but it's certainly not clear. Do you think that would be beneficial?
Yeah, I think depending upon the specific task you're trying to solve. I mean, in a sense, we've kind of already done that just by like looking at salience algorithms. So yeah, let me back up a step. There are a lot of people who've looked at spatial attention in the context of deep neural networks, sort of trying to figure out what are the important aspects, based upon like if you're looking for, animals, can you build a model? Can you build an attention system that can interface with the deep neural network and then specifically attend to animals at their location? And the answer is yes. Other people have found that you can do that. Those models don't have the specific sort of circuit architecture that we've developed. They use different approaches. But yeah, I think that would be fruitful. I think the hard part is always trying to sort of define a scope in which that is useful. So whether that is trying to explain specific empirical phenomena that exist, and I guess the reason that it's hard to find a specific use for that in terms of explaining experimental data is that there's comparatively little data telling us exactly where we attend in natural stimuli in movies, because those stimuli are so under constrained. I mean, this is why the experimental literature likes their assertive squares and circles, because then we can control exactly what's going on. So I think that there's a sort of paucity of behavioral data that would tell us what people would actually attend to. Like, I mean, you can get like accuracy scores, like can people detect the animal, yes or no, but does that necessarily tell you what was the sort of spatial delineation of what they were attending when they saw that particular frame of that particular movie? That is a really hard problem to discover experimentally. So I think in terms of that, you run into a data problem, but that's not to say that you can't develop really cool application approaches to perhaps decode information from movies or something in a way that gives the model some fundamentally new capabilities that it didn't have otherwise. But I think in order to sort of realize the benefits of something like Ragnarok, it's not simply enough perhaps to try to be decoding exactly what is in a given movie. You would want to sort of interface it with a bigger cognitive system that has additional requirements, like, for example, building, like in a lifelong learning context. That's what I sort of like, I'm framing all of these things. I'm becoming a developmental psychologist very gradually as I sort of dig into this, as I realize that the sort of more interesting question is how do we build the sort of like, bigger cognitive architecture from the input.
Completely with you there.
Yeah. So I'm kind of falling down this rabbit hole and I can't stop it. And so like you would want to sort of, I guess that's where the benefits would be, right? Is if you're building lifelong learning models.
Right. And I guess closing that loop you were talking about, does this actually clean up your training examples? Can you think of that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And on this working memory idea, these are really compelling set of pictures you lay out there. I'm wondering if there's a sense you have of the required number of neurons to have to be in this binding pool. Because sometimes I feel like, I'm not very familiar with these models, but it looks like those need to be pretty giant and you can remember like still a very low number of items. Is that true? Or how does that scale?
Yeah, so for example, in this model, if we're only trying to store the latent space, for the compressed latent space in the bottleneck, we can have a pretty small binding pool, like only 100 neurons or so is okay. Of course, the smaller the number of neurons, the worse the interference is going to get when you try to store multiple items in it. So, but let's say 500 neurons could do a pretty good job of storing 4 items with the resolution that you saw there. The limitation that we ran into in terms of, making the binding pool as small as possible was getting the novel stimuli to look good, because the binding pools attempt to reconstruct the L1 latent space, which is, I think, 256 neurons. So the L1 is 256 different values. Reconstructing a latent space in 256 versus 8 in the bottleneck is a lot more difficult. Now, it should also be said that we don't do any kind of optimization of the weights putting information into the binding pool. Those are just literally normally distributed random values. So if you imagine that gradient descent was also able to operate on those weights, you might be able to build a much more efficient representation with a smaller number of binding pool nodes. But so, thinking about what you can squeeze into that binding pool space where we have, let's say 2,500 neurons in the binding pool, of which each token accesses 40%, which is 1,000. You can store multiple different items in that larger binding pool, and for each one of those items, you can store multiple different latent representations. Now, it would still be more efficient to just store literally the pixel values. I can't. Sorry, I need to remember the math. Each one of these stimuli is 28 squared times 3. So you could probably store the literal representations within the binding pool, and it would be approximately the same number of neurons.
Right.
But again, we haven't done any kind of optimization, and we also have the flexibility of creating specific representations of just the information that we want, which is the sort of advantage. And I'll add one more aspect to that, which is that the binding pool as we have here is only storing information from the sort of visual hierarchy. But this same binding pool could, without any modification, be also used to store representations of auditory stimuli, somatosensory stimuli. So basically anything can sort of dump into it. So you can have that extra advantage as well.
Right. Yeah, it almost seems like there's a tension there, because you, in some sense, maybe you need the weights to remain untrained and not adapted to the stimuli in order to maintain that flexibility, and then you're perhaps stuck with this. Okay, so Tom Wallace, maybe this will be the last question before we go to the discussion Zoom. Have you tested whether thresholding a saliency model like GBVS with Ragnarok improves fixation prediction?
Nope, we haven't. That's a great question. We haven't. I mean, taking Ragnarok and using that to generate fixation predictions is, I think, one of the sort of neat next steps that that model could go in. We've been talking with Nick Gaspelin, who's done a lot of the attention work on looking at how fixations are determined by salience. And in fact, his work is sort of a large part of how we understand that there is suppression of distractors specifically. So yeah, I think that there's a great use case of linking this to eye movements. And then, something like GBVS, for example, or, a deeper gaze would also be a good way to do that as well. We chose GBVS because it was fast, super fast. That was basically the reason. And we didn't really care in this particular case we weren't optimizing on the best salience map in terms of benchmarks. We just wanted one that gave us something somewhat reasonable and quickly.
Great. Okay, well, thanks again for your talk, and thanks everyone for joining us. And the link for the Zoom is in the chat. Come to listen, discuss, pose your questions. We'll see you there.